All right, we should be live. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Méline Lafabrie. I'm the founder of aidóni, the organization organizing this online event tonight. With me, you have Sham Jaff, our guest that I'm going to introduce a bit more later, and Nicolas, who is also working with me with aidóni. And he will be the one helping us and making sure everything goes smoothly with all the technical issues. So if you have any problems, any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and he's going to be here to help you with that. All right. Thank you, Nicola. So the event today it's called Expanding the Lens. Looking, beyond the global majority. We're going to define those terms a bit later on. And we organize those aidóni talks a bit once a month. We've took a little break this year, but now we're back and very excited. And we organize those events to have conversation with journalists, experts, activists, people on the ground to talk about how we can make journalism more constructive, more inclusive, which is the focus of aidóni, our organization. What we do is we organize events like this ones, but we also produce journalism. In a few seconds, Nicola is going to share all the information and some links where you can find our website or social media, register for a newsletter, and get all the information you want about aidóni. But now I'm just going to jump in what we're all here for today and introduce you Sham, who is our guest. Sham is an award-winning journalist. She is based in Germany. You worked on podcasts, broadcast, everything, right? A bit. I feel like you've done everything. And about 10 years ago, you founded the newsletter called What Happened Last Week, which is one of my personal favorites. And I know on my team, it is well beloved. So that's it for the professional aspect. But at aidóni, it's very important for us to know who we are, where we stand in, where we come from, because we think it has a huge impact on how you see the world and how you interact with it. So Sham, please, can you introduce yourself in your own words?
Thank you, Méline. Thank you, Nicola, in the background, making sure that this all runs so smoothly. And thank you for having me, Méline. This is so nice. 10 years ago, I started this newsletter, and I have been working as a freelance journalist for a little bit longer than that. And I am, well, how would I introduce myself? I'm Kurdish. I lived in Germany for the past 25 years, but my family and we came to Germany when I was 9 from Kurdistan, and I now live in Berlin, work in Berlin, and the kind of work that the topics that drew me to journalism are basically the topics that have personally affected me my entire life. And I grew up watching two different kind of news channels. Basically, one would be the German news, and the other one would be the Kurdish news channel. And I always noticed that they were talking about two different things, and from very different perspectives. And growing up within the Kurdish community, and also going to German school and university, and working at different jobs in Germany, I noticed that people really approach everything from a different perspective. And I was exposed to a lot of stereotypes, a lot of prejudices about what Kurds are like, where Kurdistan is even. And for me, I think that's why I also became a political scientist and a journalist. I wanted to understand why people had these different perceptions of Kurds and Kurdistan, and also the rest of the world, and also what I can then contribute to hopefully expanding the lens.
Well, thank you for that. So now, if we can talk a bit more about what happened last week, um, even if from your previous answer we can kind of guess what drawn you to create this space. Can you explain how it all started? Was there a specific moment where you're like, I need to do that, or maybe it was a collection of moments that led you
Ooh,
there?
that's a great question. Okay, so what happened last week? I think grew from two different kind of feelings. One of them being frustration, a lot of frustration, and the other one being curiosity. Frustration because I kept seeing, articles and reports and documentaries, even, or movies about places in the world where, or countries and regions in the world that were historically kind of marginalized in global power structures, primarily, Asia, Africa, the Americas, even, some parts of Oceania. Like countries and regions that have kind of all undergone like experiences of colonialism, economic exploitation, struggles for sovereignty. I mean, like as a Kurdish person, I'm very much interested in the topics of sovereignty and self-determination. And I noticed that when those reports were a lot of times, there were some things wrong with it. And if I say some things, I mean a lot of things. And as I grew more and more into my journalistic career, I noticed, the frustration kind of growing bigger and bigger. But the other emotion was joy also, because and curiosity, was because with curiosity I kind of associate joy, because me as someone Kurdish, it doesn't really mean that I know the entire so-called global south, that I can't fully comprehend what it is to be from another place than the place that I have been. So I've always been a really, really curious person, and curiosity really did guide me in the way that I pursue my own journalism. And have been so curious about so many parts of the world that I didn't see on screen, that I didn't see in newspapers. I've always felt like the world was a little bit too black and white, and not too many different colors. And so, yeah, those were the two emotions I think that inspired me to start what happened last week.
Hmm. I can truly relate. Those are the emotions I talk about each time people ask me why I started aidóni. The first one I say is frustration. Uh, so yeah, I can.
Frustration can be like, I don't think frustration sometimes can be a sustainable thing to motivate you, right? Like I think you also need, in my perspective, my personal experience, I needed also like a positive counterpart to
Mm,
keep going. If there wasn't, I think I'd be having a tough time now
yeah,
after.
I was going to say, if you, I think at least for me, if you want your frustration to produce something meaningful and impactful, it has to be kind of coupled with hope,
Yeah,
in the way that you're frustrated, but there's a better way to do it.
yeah,
And also for me, finding my people, in the way, like finding people, for example, like you, like people we meet when we go to events, the huge team, because I didn't say, but I don't know, we're 30 people based in about 17, 20 countries.
yeah,
People tend to move around, um, and seeing that, this frustration and the things we observed and felt were shared by people coming from so many different backgrounds. On the team, we have people in Nigeria, in Pakistan,
mm,
um, Europe, Ukraine, and all over, and they can relate to that.
yeah,
So I think
yeah,
frustration is a good place to start, but then you kind of have to find what to do with it.
yeah,
It's a good
100%.
matter. Um, So maybe before we go a bit more about motivations and what does it mean and things like this, can you, for someone who's never seen your newsletter, what's inside? How do you organize it? What will you find if people register to it? By the way, if you go in the links in the comments, you also have links to your Sham social media and the newsletter, and a link to directly register, which I think you should do.
Thank you so much. Could I also share maybe like a link to the recent issue from
Yes,
yesterday?
of
I think
course.
that'd be great for people to kind of like follow along. I'll just quickly join the chat. Um, just it's going to take me a little bit. It wants me to just sign into YouTube, but I think so. That's like one of the weaknesses because I think I need to. Sometimes, like when I talk to people about the newsletter and they don't know anything about it, and
Mm.
then they sign up, they're like, I think you needed to definitely like a teaser link is like how it looks because it's a lot. I was just able to get on there. Oh, I don't know how that works. I'm just gonna send it to you privately, Millie. Maybe you can share it then.
Okay, yes, let's do it. No
It
worries.
doesn't work, unfortunately. But so the way I've structured it, I wanted it to be some like as in like people want to open the email because emails can get really overwhelming. Like we're overwhelmed by so much information all the time. Like we keep getting messages on our phones. I know I am overwhelmed, and if I am overwhelmed, maybe like more people are overwhelmed. And so I wanted to design the email in a way that people feel like they can look forward to reading it. And so I wanted it to be simple language. So I wanted to be accessible as accessible as possible. I wanted it to be um, well, basically, pop culture references. I wanted it to be something that people read and then they can share, on their first dates with people, or when they go for a coffee break with friends. Something that just to normalize basically all these things that we've like they've missed out on. To be like, what happened? This is crazy, and then to try and become a little bit more curious and engaged with the topic.
Mm.
That normally doesn't really happen or take place. And so I also ask myself supposedly dumb questions. So whenever I kind of read about something that's happened, I ask myself like, what's sort of like a question that perhaps like my younger cousins would ask themselves. And also I try to always, this is one of the bigger parts of it. Oh, thank you so much for posting the link now. Always, a bigger part of it is to also ask, why does this even matter? Why should you pay attention? And to give the people a sense of, how relevant these topics are, just because they don't really take place on the bigger news outlets that you're used to watching, you're used to following. It doesn't really mean that they're not important. It just means they're not taking place. They're for so many different reasons. And so I want people to feel like they can quickly get into something that they maybe before thought was impossible to do, or maybe they thought, oh, it's a bit intimidating, I would have to read up on so much. And so I try to I try to lower that, basically that bar. And also I put in recommendations, I put in good news. I That's like one of the things that I've definitely started paying a lot more attention to since the pandemic. People really crave good news, so I look for them very actively all throughout the week. And I, post videos of the week, for example, like music videos, movies that I've watched that I think people would love it. Funny bits, just funny news. The email always ends on a funny note. I know a lot of times I talk about really heavy topics, and I think ending the email on a funny note might help help them find their way back into the inbox the next Monday. So that's how it basically looks. I don't know. What has your experience been with the newsletter? It would be so interesting to get direct feedback from a reader.
Well, I was gonna say, I love how I feel like you're just talking to me, and when I read it, it's what you write. If people register, you have a bit of an introduction, and you say that you want to talk to people like you're just having coffee and talking about what you read last week or what happened. And many people kind of make that promise, and it kind of gets lost as you write, because you want to professionalize it, and we have a certain idea of what news should be, and it's serious, and it have to be written in a very specific way. And I think we're probably going to spend some time on it a bit later in the conversation. But what is the right way of doing journalism is also from a very specific perspective, which is usually based in Europe or in the States, and very white and very male. If you go any other way, then it's not serious enough, and it's not that way, and it's not true. Europe is very serious. The quality is super high. I love that I always discover new sources, new media, and new people. And I'm a journalist, and I work at look with journalists from the global majority, and giving space for the voices and the experiences and the stories. So I think it's kind of my job to know about those resources, but I still discover so many through your work,
That
which
is so
is
nice to hear. Thank you. Thank you so
well,
much.
um, and yeah, so I wanted to come back to exactly, so why, because you talked about like why it's useful to diversify your sources, to go look over it. But like, can we explain a bit why it's actually very important to not just consume what we call mainstream Western uh, media?
Yeah, like when we talk about international news, we actually only mean English language news. I mean, that's something I think that a lot of people I think need to that's like one of the first things that I think would be interesting to like start from, because there's so many things that are I'm not saying that everything is bad. There are like a lot of great journalists doing really great work. But for the most part, unfortunately, it's been sort of like a tendency to produce
Mhm.
news that disproportionately focus on Western countries when we talk about international news, basically sidelining the global majority. We also would use a lot of narratives. The narratives, they portray the global majority as, poor, unstable, even violent. We have, a lot of event-driven coverage. For example, if there are no crises anywhere happening, the reporting basically has no job there. Like, we don't pay attention to it. We ignore systemic issues because of that. We ignore long-term stories. We also ignore a lot of stories of progress that happen, because we do have a sort of focus on conflict and crises when it comes to portraying the global majority. There's a lot also the habit of framing the global majority as strange or other. For Western audiences, exoticization really happens a lot in that space. We have a single story narrative. I saw on your Instagram you shared the Adichie quote from her famous TED talk about the single story, about the danger of the single story. There's a lot of that in international news, simplistic storytelling that really erases the diversity within those regions. We don't, that's just like one of the reasons why I don't really like to use the term global South, because it also reduces the diversity of dynamic, the dynamic between different countries there. Do all of those countries still belong to the global south, or whatever the global south is? What do we really want? What do we want to say when we say the global south? And also, like, one of the other things that I've noticed over the past 10 years is that, there are very few journalists from the global majority that are in national newsrooms. I mean, you know this as, aidóni, wanting to close that gap. We have sometimes, a lot of agenda setting by international outlets that, prioritize stories that align with specific interests, mostly Western interests or politics. We have sometimes when we talk about, crises and wars, we have a lack of context. So when we talk about, sometimes long-term crises that are happening over there, we don't even know nuances there, like the cultural nuances, the historical ones, the geopolitical ones. Just so much context gets lost. And there's, I don't know, so many other things. Sensationalism is also another thing. We overemphasize things that we think attract attention. There's like saying that, negative news kind of pull the most clicks. Yes, sure, that's true. It does kind of produce a lot of fear, and fear does activate a lot of people. But going back to, the positive counterparts, I think also joy, inspiration, also all those other emotions are also people are really thirsty for those emotions as well, specifically in international news. And they're like colonial frames, or the habit of neglecting local solutions, the imbalance in sources, economic biases. We tend to talk about the countries who are economically more well off than the ones who are not. We ignore you know, the fact that entire continents are not as monolithic as we think they are. We talk about Africa as if it's just like, one small village, which is definitely not. I mean,
Where
there
they
are
speak African.
yeah. And I mean, there are also, like, as I said, there are also like great foreign correspondents, but also the fact that we sometimes over rely on foreign correspondents is a huge problem, instead of living with local reporters who have a lived experience. Um, that sometimes does lead to a misrepresentation of what's going on in the countries. We misquote, we mistranslate some local sources, local narratives get lost. So there's so many things that I've noticed over the past few years that I think we can do better.
Hmm. Definitely agree with that. I've taken many notes. I have so many things to go back to. But first, maybe can we, in case we have people who are not familiarized with the term, define what we mean by global majority? Because unfortunately, it's not yet a term that is widely used.
Right. I think it's just a term that I've also come across in the past few years. It definitely, for me, it recognizes just the sheer demographic majority of people living in the so-called global South, in Africa, in Asia, and the Americas, because they do encompass over 80% of the world's population. Like, over 80% of whoever lives on this planet lives outside of the West. And so now it becomes even more absurd. It becomes even more frustrating that the way we talk about those people is so deeply flawed. It becomes even more urgent to work on this topic. Yeah, I think the term definitely shifts focus from like a from a narrative that is a little bit more deficit based, to one of more just representation, honestly, just emphasizing the need for those perspectives to be heard a lot more. That's why I like the term a lot more. It's a lot less north versus south. It's more about, let's talk about the countries where a lot of people live. Let's talk about those regions. What are they dealing with?
And I feel it's also about accuracy and reminding people that, especially when you live in Europe or like North America, the way you're getting information is like where you're from is the majority of people. The majority of people live like you, and have more or less the same perspective, which is absolutely not true. Um, and I think it's good to have a bit of humility and recognize that, well, we're not the majority.
Yeah.
And so it matters to listen to the voices of the many and in many different ways. And also talking about accuracy, we're talking about the fact that um, you added or you mainly focus on positive news and that people want it. And I think talking about solutions is also about accuracy, because saying that it's not only focusing on issues and conflict, you're not reporting on everything that's happening, because for each issue you have maybe 10 solutions that they don't all work, but it's worth it to take a look, observe, like, how was the idea born, how did it work, if it works perfect, what are the limits, what could we fix next time we implement it, and if it didn't work, then why, and next time we can learn from it,
Mm.
and be inspired, because a solution that, I don't know, is implemented somewhere in the mountains of Venezuela maybe can be very useful in the mountains of Pakistan.
Mhm.
For
Yeah.
nobody, if you don't know about it, if nobody cares and nobody talks about it, then how would you know? How would you be, inspired? Um,
100%. I think it's not telling the entire story. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think when we tend to focus on problems, I think it's definitely part of good journalism is to describe the problem really well, is to figure out what's not going well. But it's also, I think, to look a little bit ahead and be like, okay, so who has some ideas? Who has maybe at least a strategy? Who has done it maybe? Can we learn from those people? And I find that a lot of people, I find also for myself, if I would just speak for myself, if I read those stories, I think it leaves me with a different kind of feeling. It leaves me with a different kind of, mm, yeah, curiosity. Curiosity is one of my favorite words because I think if you stop being curious about solutions, you just get stuck. Mm, yeah, you just get stuck. That's not a good place to be.
no, and I mean, and it's not just you, like, it's backed up by science and research. The fact that when you publish what they call solution stories, um, people spend more time reading them, they share them more with other people, and also, like, in neuroscience, the fact that you have hope for it, it starts hope, and hope is the beginning of everything, of finding your place in society and seeing
Mm,
yourself as a citizen, because before anything else, at the very beginning, that's what journalism is about, helping
mm,
you knowing everything that's happening, because it's very complicated to be informed all the time. We're busy, we work, we understand, and give you all the information so you can play your role as actively as you want. There are no mandatory involvement, but as a citizen. And I think if all citizens lose hope and are very depressed by the news, then I don't know where we're going, but I'm not really interested to go there um,
mm,
in that way. Um, I want to talk because 10 years now we see a bit more of conversations about the global south and the need to diversify sources, even if it's still in some bubbles. Um, it's a conversation that is starting to happen, have been for a few years, but you 10 years ago, it was it a conversation yet?
not a very loud one.
Mm,
No, not a very loud one. And I think for me, it was like in my early days of journalism, I didn't think there was a space for me and for those perspectives. I didn't see them anywhere. And I knew that the blogs were working. I had a blog when I was younger, and then social media kind of came around, and but then I saw that the algorithms were constantly changing, and the blogs were also unfortunately dying. And so the one reliable thing that I found was email. I wanted to go back to email, and I wanted to go back into people's inboxes and just share that really direct connection with them, because no algorithm is going to stop me from reaching my audience who want to be reached. Obviously, I don't know how many times I've subscribed to some places or followed some account and I've never seen them again. And we know that those platforms can take on a lot of political leanings that do perhaps also suppress political content, not perhaps, for sure, suppress political content. So for my work, 10 years ago, I knew that I needed to protect myself as much as I can.
And just I'm gonna follow back on this, but I just see a comment from Louisa. Hi, Louisa. It's right. She is right. I had it in my notes. The concept of global majority was coined by Rosemary Campbell Stephens. She's an educator and advocate for anti-racist practices. She has a website with her name, and she gives online resources. And I know she does trainings and things like this. So I strongly encourage everyone who is interested in the concept and learning more, or maybe educating yourself through trainings and workshops by the person who coined down the concept. Thanks a lot, Luisa. Um, so yes, we were talking about it. And so when how did people react when you first maybe talked about it or published the first editions? Was it like, who cares, or like, great, I've been waiting for this my whole life?
I think it was a mix of both. I think it was a mix of both for sure. I did message everybody I knew about the newsletter. I was like, so I have this new thing. Do you want to check it out? And it was an easy sell, honestly. I think over the years it was an easy sell all the time, because it's something that is very much lacking. You still need a lot of resources to get to the same kind of amount of news that you would get from the newsletter from elsewhere if you wanted to do it on your own. Unfortunately, there's still so much more time. So let me rephrase this. It's very, very easy to stay updated on what's happening in the West, or in the dominant Western countries. There are also countries in the West that are not very much happening in the national news section. It's very, very easy to be updated on those. It's a lot more difficult to stay updated on what's happening elsewhere. And so it was a promise that I gave to people. I was like, you know what, I'm going to try to inform you just a little bit more. I can't do much because it's like, it's so many different countries altogether, but I will try and curate some of those topics for you. If you want, you just need to sign up and read along. And that was the promise that I made. And yeah, sometimes it's very, very difficult to curate them because so much is happening. But I also don't want the email to be, I don't know, 10 pages long. So yeah, people are still reading. The open rate is consistently high. And it's one of those things, when like people who are entrepreneurs, they tell you have to have an elevator pitch. It's something that just works. It's like, it's an email full of news about, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. You probably maybe haven't heard about them because they're not talked about that much.
And so exactly, for people who want to read your newsletter, but also for people who want to, look for more information themselves. What's your process to identify those sources, to know, to find the stories, to find the journalists and the people?
So over the past decade now, it feels like I'm so old when I say this. But over the past decade, I have definitely now, have a network of journalists that I rely on. I have a list of media that I have. Someone's like 3 weeks ago, I now have an intern who's joined, Lucia Baumann, and we had our first call. And I remember, you know, giving her a little bit of like an insider look as to, how my browser looks and how my notes look and how my email inbox, like how that looks. And because I wanted to show her that. So she came from one of the mainstream news outlets in Germany, and she said she was so frustrated with the way, or um, with the lack of international news that were kind of covered. And she's been reading the newsletter for a while and was wondering how I find those stories, and because she's been trying and she doesn't know how. And you know and so in our very first conversation, I showed her, so you really have to actively look for those things. They're not going to be on your Instagram feed. They're not going to be the most hyped news products. And so, over the past few years, I have bookmarks over bookmarks over bookmarks, and subscriptions to newsletters of other creators and other new journalists all over the place, that fill my inboxes by the hundreds every day. I have my notes app where whenever I go online, I see something that has that sticks with me, that I think is would be a topic of discussion at a at a dinner table or at a coffee shop or somewhere else, where I feel like people would like to know about this, or maybe a news that would shatter some stereotypes that people have about a place, or it would add to an image, or it would complicate a narrative, or it would surprise someone. I would always jot that down into my notes app, and then from then, take it and decide whether it's a deep dive for this week, or whether it's just a smaller news section. Yeah, I think that's the problem. But you can ask me so many questions, but I can keep going.
I mean, we could stay for a long time. I think I'm gonna ask you a question for about like 10 more minutes, and then we're going to open conversation to people here, because it's not fun if it's just the two of us. And we do have some interesting comments. And one actually from Rogerio, who yes, mentions that one of the challenges with global majority is the global aspect of it, where we have a lot of countries moving inward, with nationalisms and things like this. And how do you think, well, your newsletter, or just the habit of looking for that information, being actively looking at what's happening elsewhere, do you think it can play a role in maybe opening up new perspectives? And if so, how?
I feel like I don't understand the comment very well. Um, I mean, I understand the criticism there, because globalization sometimes also, or like a lot of times, has meant Americanization. Um, it's been, it's kind of comes as this kind of comes as disguised as like, oh, economic, um, open borders economically, never for migrants, never. But I think in my newsletter, it's not about, promoting globalization. It's more about, highlighting stories that are not happening, that are underrepresented, maybe precisely because of the notion of globalization. Because there are still very much like countries and regions that are very much distinctively themselves. And as I said, not as a Kurdish person, I'm very much interested in the topic of sovereignty and self-determination, and globalization is not really like something that drives my journalism. It's more about, talking about things that are happening. It's a lot of topics that are shared by different countries. Like we are all affected by climate change, but mostly people countries in the global majority are affected by it disproportionately. We are all affected by if the financial system kind of dips, we're all affected by that as well. So there are some common topics, but there are also a lot of local topics. And I think the newsletter, in my opinion, hopefully just tries to highlight those a little bit more.
And even for the global topics, they make so much more sense when you can put actual stories and actual faces and voices of people who are very differently affected by it.
Mm.
You talked about climate change, and like the two of us, we're based in Europe, so yes, we see it. Seasons are messed up, and it's cold when it's supposed to be warm, and it's warm when it's supposed to be cold, and it's extra warm and then extra rainy and things like this. But our life is still more or less the same. And I think that maybe it's more difficult for people to understand the actual impact it has in some places and how the impact are already here,
Mm.
and having dramatic consequences, changing lives, changing economies, changing ways of living. Um, and I think it's very abstract when you talk about it like this.
Mm.
If you don't go and look for the actual stories and have someone telling you, and a mother, a father, a parent, telling you like, well, this is how it affected my life and my livelihood and my kids, then as a person who also has maybe kids or like loved ones, I can relate because I care more also, um, by extra stories. But I see Rogerio gave you a bit of an answer in the yes. Um, let's just read through that. Where I am. Nationalism presents a challenge for those wanting to promote a larger notion of global humanity. I don't know. Do you have an answer to that? Mm.
I think I might have to sit on that. Thank you, Rogerio. Rogerio, I don't know how to say your name. Sorry, I don't want to butcher it.
Um, it's so yeah, food for thoughts,
Yeah.
for next time, because so we're coming to an end, not to the event, but to our conversation. Then we're going to include a bit more people. Just like you, I kind of like to end up on a happier, hopeful note, even if I think this event has been full of resources and reasons for hope. Um, what are the changes that you can observe both in journalism and in the way people consume journalism that make you more maybe hopeful in
Mm.
general, but also in fixing what you tried to fix through your newsletter?
Okay, so you mean like internationally or?
I think you can take the questions as you want.
Mm.
Of like tendencies, practices that you've seen and that you think, well, this is going in the right direction.
I think so. Like, yeah, maybe some aspects. I love that question, by the way. It's like it did give me some. It did need a minute, a little bit, but I think the way I observe it, I don't know. Maybe older colleagues have observed this for a longer time, but I'm only 35. But the way I have observed this is very much that there has been like a diversification of voices over the years, for sure. Like I think there's a growing presence of journalists from Asia, Africa, and the Americas in international reporting. I think it can definitely be a lot larger that that presence, but it's definitely growing. I think over the past few years, I've seen a lot more collaborative journalism as well. Cross-border investigative projects like the Panama Papers, but also, for example, Unbiased the News. It's one of my favorite go-to places. They also include journalists from a lot of diverse backgrounds. They tackle, underreported topics from those areas, together with local journalists. I hadn't seen that happen before. And then Unbiased the News went and talked to different people from different countries and talked about climate justice. I think what also has happened is that maybe disaster tourism. I think that's like something that over the past few months more so I've seen that has changed a little bit more. Disaster tourism, I think, has. Let me phrase it like this. I think
Maybe just define it if people are not used to the term.
right. I think it's just like reporting during crises, during disasters and conflict and wars. I think that there's an increased awareness of not to take that reporting and turn it into disaster journalism, and to go there and to try and sensationalize what's happening without, adding a solutions-focused approach. I think what also has happened is that, with social media over the past decade, more than a past decade now, I think digital platforms, social media, they have definitely amplified marginalized voices. A lot of journalists who are now journalists, but maybe back then they started out differently. I have, stumbled upon their accounts because of social media, because of different digital platforms. Like I didn't need to go on, the bigger stuff, the bigger outlets, to find new names to follow and to consume their work. I just had to go online, and I could, curate my own list. I think, I mean, I can speak about Germany here in this sense. I think there's efforts for inclusion, for sure. I think some outlets do really actively work to avoid stereotypes. They do listen a lot more. I think thanks to a very loud, very, very loud activist scene also. Not just activists, a lot of journalists who come from diverse backgrounds are demanding that they be heard, that they be considered, that they be, let in, basically. But I mean, there's still like a lot of ongoing challenges, right? We have structural imbalances, right? Western agencies like Reuters, AFP, they still dominate global news flows. We have, I talked about this on equal narratives, of course, stories that more kind of cater to Western audiences, cater to the Western perspective. Underreported areas are still very strong. There's a lot of tokenism as well. Still, even if there is efforts for inclusion, there's still a lot of tokenism that's going around. Some diversity initiatives that do lack depth, that do just look at, someone how they look, not really what they do. The colonial framing is still very much big beast that we're still fighting. But it's a mixed picture, I would say.
I definitely agree. And I think the more you see projects like Unbears the News, we're also a huge fan here. And actually, if people are curious about Unbears the News, please go read their beautiful and very detailed stories. But also, if you go on our YouTube channel, we have an event talking about diversity and inclusivity in your stories, but also in the newsroom with Sarah, who used to work with them behind the news, and she was working with them when we did the event. I think it was last year. So if people are curious, we have a whole conversation about it. And yeah, it's true that we see more diversity, more also money to go to stories about cross-border journalism, which is because journalism is a passion work, but we still need to pay rent, and it costs a lot of money to do good journalism. And I think it's important to notice that even if it's not enough, there's more and more grants and funding for cross-border journalism, for stories coming from news desert, and things like this. So that's also good. And the colonial perspective still going strong. But I like that you mentioned social media, because I don't love being active on social media, but I do like watching and looking for people and sources and initiatives. Um, and I do love the fact that it's become such an important platform for diverse voices to be heard. Because before, you needed to be a journalist, um, to kind of have an impact on what was talked about and how it was talked about, and who you were talking about it with,
Mhm.
which were very often the same experts that you would see everywhere. And social media kind of forced journalists to look outside of the window, because those voices are heard and they're making noise. And if you're not listening to it, then it looks like it's very obviously that you're avoiding. Um,
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think algorithms too sometimes can
yeah.
deceive, right? Algorithms sometimes, as I said, I think there's been a push to suppress
Mm,
political content, right? For example, on Instagram, where people need to actively opt in to receive
mm,
political news. If they do not, then they might, miss out on so much that's going on. Specifically right now, like that's going on in Palestine, in
mm,
Gaza, if they do not, you know, opt in. So there's that.
mm,
But I think it's more like about, how I remember like going on Twitter when it was Twitter and when it was not as much of a bad place to be for my mental health. But I remember going on Twitter as a young journalist, and I was able to, contact of so many people,
mm,
and so many of my idols even back then.
mm,
I there was a lot of like there were these networking capabilities that we had, that I'm so grateful for. I think
mm,
I had a better start in my journalism career because of it, because of
mm,
social media. And now with the newsletter, I know if something's happening somewhere, I'll go online and see what people have watched. I mean, a lot of fact checking
mm,
definitely works also by, going through social media and checking what people have posted, what and where. So it can be, yeah, it can be two things at the same time. It can
yeah.
be a show and it can be a curse.
Mm. I have a comment on this, but while I'll do that comment, if people have questions, it's already 50 minutes. And so please ask them in the comment, and then we'll bring them up and answer them. Please don't be shy and ask away while you type your questions. Um, yeah, I think it's definitely the two, happening at the same time. And that's why what you mentioned earlier, being actively looking for different informations from different places. Um, I think if you combine both, like I see my algorithm change when I don't during one week I don't have time to do that work, to go actively looking for information. Then it looks very different. It's very different from when I'm doing it and I'm seeing different type of news in the suggestions. I have different kind of organizations and people talking to it. So I think, yeah, what matters is being aware of
Yeah.
it, and try to use it for our purpose. But um, well, maybe we were very clear. I do not see any questions. Um, in the meantime, well, I'm really thinking. I think this is for you.
Thank you so
For you,
much,
Blair.
Annie. It fills me with so much joy. Thanks so much.
Mhm.
I do. You told me. I mean, maybe some people are still thinking about questions, but um, I would love to use the space also to, give people some of the things that really do inspire me, some things, and that are resources. So yes, unbiased the news is one of the things. But I also, I mean, as a Kurdish person, I also would love for people to check out this project. On It's at the Digital Archive. Basically, it's a collection of informative stories, interviews, research articles that focus only on Kurdish female figures of both past and present day Kurdistan, and it's done with so much love. And that archive is still very much well, evolving. It's one of the things that I really like looking at. Another resource that I really, really love is The Continentalist. I've, some of their things that they've done, infographic, info, what are they called? Info articles that they've done. The other day, I read this one, and I shared it on What Happened Last Week as well. It was about the fact that leisure can be a feminist act. And I love that story so much, and I wanted to share it with some people here because it was a long read, and it would really surprise me in so many different ways about like local solutions as to how feminists in different places around South Asia, Southeast Asia, are dealing with the fact that it's just a very sometimes it's a very difficult or dangerous place to go outside, to go and to pursue hobbies, and how people are kind of, interacting with that dynamic. So yeah, these are some of the resources, but I'm sure like so many others have others. I would love it if some people would share. If you don't have any right now, you can just email me or Meline. I'm always eager to find out more.
Well, thank you. We have a few minutes left in the 3.5 minutes. And is there anything else you think you wanted to talk about? I don't know, the last.
I think so what I wanted to say is like I love the title that you gave to this talk, expanding the lens, and I think it's something that we can all do. So if let's say like Anali, if you were like a young journalist who's starting out, I hope you do continue to expand the lens with us, because it's a very difficult thing to do. And I would love it if more and more people kind of joined us. And for everyone else who's not a journalist, I would urge you to diversify your news sources. Just pick, try to go for magazines. Try to use these resources and get inspired by so much that's out there, and not just go to the usual suspects for news.
Well, couldn't have said it any better. There are great projects and people out there. It takes a bit of time and energy to find them, but usually when you find one, it's kind of like a threat. You can go for the sources and people they partner with, and then just discover a whole new world of people doing things in a more, constructive, decolonial, feminist, more diverse, inclusive, constructive perspective. I
So,
think.
thank you also to you for moderating the space.
Well, with great pleasure. I always love talking with you. I'm very glad we could have this conversation. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope people who watched us also did, and maybe learned a few things or were challenged or questions by it. In the comments, you can see the links for Sham's social media, how to register to her newsletter, which I strongly encourage you to, and also link to find aidóni social media or website, and a link to support the work that we do. So I think that's all for today. We'll keep you updated for the next event. Hopefully, it will happen at the end of January. So make sure to follow us to not miss it. Wherever you are, please have a nice day. Enjoy your evening. I don't know what time is it for you. And until next time.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye.
Bye.